Blog Talk Radio.
BangTheBook.com.
Welcome everybody to the Week 9 edition of the BangTheBook.com College Football Podcast here on the Blog Talk Radio Network. I'm your host, Adam Burke. Joining me, as always, BangTheBook.com expert handicapper and resident college football and college basketball expert, Mr. Kyle Hunter. Kyle, how's it going today, man?
I'm doing great, man. I'm ready for Week 9. We had a great Week 8.
We absolutely did. We had a great Week 8. And, you know, we try not to really, obviously we promote the show, but we try not to promote ourselves too much on this. We try to, stick to giving out information and angles on both sides of the game. We give out picks, obviously, because that's what people are interested in hearing. But, really we want to talk about the process and about, how to come to a decision. But I don't think there's anything wrong with patting ourselves on the back for last week. The games that we broke down, we had a pretty good handle on all of them.
Yeah, we really did. Last week, I think, was probably the best show we've had as far as breaking down the games in depth and really having a good handle on them. Hopefully, a lot of the listeners made a lot of money last week. Both of us really liked Kansas State money line, and that one came in. That was around plus 250, so that's a big winner. We both really liked Alabama against the spread. That was probably the best play on the board last week based on the way they dominated. Lean toward West Virginia, both of us, and then Adam really liked Notre Dame, and that was a really solid pick as well. So a lot of good things out of last week's show. Also, the free pick was a winner at the end of last week. So a lot of money to be made by listening to the show, I think, and I think that's just a good opportunity for us to show that this is a podcast where you really can listen in and make money and learn some things, and hopefully everybody can tell their friends about it, and we'll get a little bit bigger audience moving forward.
Yeah, we may have been a little bit fortunate with the Kansas State money line, although you and I both love the plus 7.5. I believe it closed 7. So if you were able to jump in on Kansas State early, you got a very good number there, and number wound up not even mattering. A couple missed field goals, including a 19-yard chip shot for Oklahoma, also a blocked extra point. So a lot of things went wrong for the Sooners there, but the spread play came in easy regardless. So, even if you want to rain on our parade a little bit about the money line, we were still pretty dead on about that game. And Alabama, absolutely. They came out. Nick Saban made a statement, defended his team last week to the media and to the fan base, talking about some of the disenfranchised groups out there. And they put together a tremendous showing against Texas A&M. And that Notre Dame game, obviously Notre Dame with a chance to win that game at the end, wind up losing because of an offensive pass interference call. I'm obviously not going to debate whether or not that was the right call. I mean, that horse has been beaten to death already. But you really got to think this Florida State team is on borrowed time right now.
Yeah, I agree. Florida State's really, really fortunate to be unbeaten at this point. I'm a little disappointed we're not going to spend the whole show just debating whether that was pass interference, though.
Yeah, right. We certainly could. Well, at least the silver lining to everything is that everything's been about the call and not about something Jameis Winston did wrong. So we'll see if that holds true throughout the rest of the week. But we'd like to talk about some college football news and notes, some injury updates, possibly some trends, or update how the year-to-date stats look for favorites, underdogs, etc. We do that in a segment called the Quick Hitters. Kyle, I'm sure you've got several things to talk about for this week's show, so let's jump right in.
Yeah, I want to start with Clemson. Clemson's really had some serious injury problems already with Deshaun Watson being out. Talked about on the show before how much I think of Deshaun Watson, and it's really a big step down to Cole Stout. Stout's not completely healthy right now either, and I think Clemson's changing their game plan a little bit because of that. Now they're without running back Adam Choi, tore his ACL last week. Also, they're starting tight end Leggett. So Tigers have a lot of lost weapons on the offensive end, and that really has made them turn into a different team. It also makes them really lean on their defense.
And don't forget, too, I mean, this is a team that lost a ton from last year. Obviously, Taj Boyd and Sammy Watkins, the big names. But they've also lost some pieces throughout the last couple of years. Andre Ellington, DeAndre Hopkins. So this is a team that's had a lot of offensive turnover. as I talked about on last week's show, Chad Morris, their offensive coordinator, one of the hotter names in college football. He'll probably wind up being a head coach somewhere over the next couple of years, especially if he's able to do something really special with this group. And it seemed like Deshaun Watson was on that kind of path before he got hurt. But, only 17 points against Boston College last week, 398 yards. Definitely something to watch with Clemson going forward, especially in a conference like the ACC where Clemson really has this perception. They're still 4-1 in the conference. Maybe able to get some value on some of the bad teams in the ACC going up against the Tigers.
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's going to be value going against Clemson just because it's going to be hard for them to cover big numbers with that kind of offense. Baylor lost the game last week. They also lost 2 key offensive linemen to injuries. The Bears are really starting to hurt in the trenches right now. That's something to keep an eye on moving forward because obviously Baylor has some key games coming up in the next few weeks.
Yeah, they lost guard Desmond Hilliard and offensive tackle Troy Baker. And a couple of weeks ago on the defensive line, they lost defensive end Jamal Palmer to a torn ACL. So definite problems in the trenches for Baylor, and I think we've kind of seen that, sort of having an effect. Obviously, they lose to West Virginia this week. Had a lot of problems at the line of scrimmage against TCU the week before. So Baylor's still this dynamic offensive team that's still going to be asked to cover big numbers, but and of course the health of Bryce Petty has been a question mark all year long anyway.
Next up, I want to talk about Oklahoma State, another Big 12 team. I actually didn't make this story up, so everybody that's listening and that thinks this sounds made up, it really is a true story. 2 players were arrested for falling asleep in the Whataburger drive-thru. So just one of the crazier stories out there. Also, Seals is one of their key wide receivers, so remains to be seen exactly what kind of suspension or how many games they're going to miss. But that was certainly an interesting one from this week.
Yeah, and I was on Oklahoma State, so I can't really blame the players for drinking heavily. But, if you're going to drink heavily, don't get behind the wheel. That goes without saying. And that's also kind of a PSA for our listeners out there. But a very strange situation. It'll be interesting to see how Mike Gundy handles it. I was really surprised with how flat Oklahoma State was last week. I thought they'd show up in what could have been a letdown spot for TCU, and they just got blown out from the opening kickoff. So kind of wondering about the perception of Oklahoma State going forward.
Yeah, and I wonder if Oklahoma State didn't get boosted a little bit too much perception-wise because of their close game with Florida State, because we've seen several teams now play really close with Florida State. It seems like the Seminoles aren't the same team they were last year, so maybe Oklahoma State's not quite as good as what they looked based on that initial close game earlier in the year. Next up, though, I have Maryland. Maryland has 18 guys on the injury report this week. Just a really strange trend there at Maryland. It seems like every single year this happens to Randy Edsall's team there at Maryland. And make sure you check the status of C.J. Brown this week. It looks like he'll probably play, but if C.J. Brown doesn't play at quarterback for Maryland, then they're really in trouble. So make sure he's going to play before you back Maryland this week.
Yeah, I've already jumped on Wisconsin for this week, and even if Brown plays, he's not 100%. Their backup quarterback's out for the year with, I believe, a torn ACL, Caleb Rowe. So that would leave it to Perry Hills if C.J. Brown goes out again, which seems very likely. But also they've had a lot of injury problems at wide receiver so far this year. So this is a team, it's kind of surprising what they're doing offensively, and I think you got to give a lot of credit to Randy Edsall. But the last thing you want as a banged-up team is to take on a physical team like Wisconsin.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Wisconsin's a good play there. A pretty small number considering all the injuries and the fact that Wisconsin's such a good home team, too. Siler Miles is questionable for Washington this week against Arizona State. So that's something to keep a close eye on as well. I think Washington's offense really relies a lot on him at this point. He seems to be progressing quite a bit. Chris Peterson doesn't really have any other good options at quarterback, so definitely need to check on his status as well this week.
Well, and also in that same game, it seems like Taylor Kelly's going to be back and be the starting quarterback for Arizona State. So you got one team that could very likely be without their starting quarterback and one team getting their starting quarterback back. So Arizona State, 3.5-point chalk at Washington this week. Washington historically a very tough place to play, so I think that line is very telling.
Yeah, it's very telling. All I wouldn't want to take Arizona State as 3.5-point chalk even without Siler Miles, but I'd also be hesitant to back Washington in that spot. I think that's a good stay-away game. Georgia Tech's Zach Lasky will miss this week's game. He's kind of their bruising running back. It's interesting because I read that Georgia Tech is considering burning C.J. Leggett's red shirt to replace him. I think at this point in the season, it'd be really tough for me to burn a red shirt of a player that they consider to be one of their best future stars in the backfield. So keep an eye on that one, but I think Georgia Tech should stay away from burning that red shirt.
You would think so, especially with a system offense like they have where there are, 6 or 7 guys in any given game, if not more, that get touches in the running game. So, yeah, I don't really see the need to do that, but I believe I saw the number was 4 earlier today. It's down to 3 or 3.5 most places, so it looks like a little bit of Yellow Jacket money coming in.
Virginia Tech's another team that has a really long injury list at this point. Luther Mattey's now out for the year. He's a really good defensive lineman, and that's a big hit for them. Bud Foster in the defense has been the only reason that Virginia Tech's even been in some games here lately because their offense has been so bad. So that's a big hit for them. Their injury list is not quite as long as Maryland, but it's getting pretty long too.
Yeah, Virginia Tech also has 3 running backs that are out. I believe Marshawn Williams, Shai McKenzie, or unless it's Shea McKenzie, and Trey Edmonds. So, Michael Brewer, the guy that we kind of thought was the missing piece for that offense, he really hasn't played well. They're down 3 running backs on the depth chart already. And I think it's very evident with the move on the line for their Thursday night game against Miami where Virginia Tech opened -2. Now they're a 2.5 up to 3-point underdog at home for the Thursday night game. And that's not really something we've seen much during the Frank Beamer era, maybe not at all.
Yeah, that's a really interesting line move, and I'd be inclined to take Virginia Tech at that price just because they did play poorly last week. Not an easy place to play either at Virginia Tech. So Miami has a freshman quarterback. You guys still think that Bud Foster's going to come up with some tough defensive schemes for him to go against. So I kind of like Virginia Tech in that one, but I don't like fading that kind of scheme. The last point I had on the quick hitters for this week is underdogs are now 208 and 180 on the year. That's 53.6% winners by just playing the underdog. That's going to be something I want to watch for the rest of the year to see if that gets adjusted. It usually ends up pretty even. So seeing almost 54% underdogs this late in the season is a pretty interesting trend.
Well, I think that's kind of a byproduct of the fact that we don't really have an elite team in college football this year. I know Mississippi State and Ole Miss have had some really big wins. Florida State's still undefeated. But, I think all 3 of those teams are vulnerable. The Mississippi teams mostly just because of the caliber of schedule that they play. I do think they're both very good programs. But, we don't have a dominant, powerful team. I mean, we saw Baylor get knocked off this week. That takes away one of the unbeatens, and then Mississippi and Mississippi State. One of those 2 teams will have to suffer a loss in the Egg Bowl. So I think it's really a byproduct of the fact that we've had a lot of top 25 matchups of, I want to say, little brother type teams beating big brother type teams, like Ole Miss and Alabama and things like that. So I think that has a big part in it as well, where these historically very public teams, at least over the last couple of seasons, have really struggled.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there has been quite a few of those spots where it's that kind of big brother, little brother thing. And even the Carolina team, who's played really well this year, has had several spots like that where they're really seen as second rate and they come in and win the game outright. So you're right that there's no really dominant team in college football. And it seems like everybody keeps looking to see one. And even though Ole Miss and Mississippi State are playing really well, I don't think I'd consider them really dominant like we've seen in some years. And it seems like everybody just keeps looking for that dominant team, and they keep getting knocked off little by little. So just kind of waiting for the next shoe to drop.
Well, I want to spend 2. Or did you have any other points for the quick hitters?
Nope, that's it.
All right. I had a couple real quick ones, and we'll get in the Inside the Line segment. Oregon State, a couple big injuries for them. Richard Mullaney and Storm Woods. Mullaney, a wide receiver, Woods, a running back. Both left the game against Utah with what appear to be serious injuries. Oregon State plays Stanford this week, so I know that's one that you and I talked about off air as one where we kind of had a lean to the under in that one. Also, South Carolina has a tough game this week against Auburn. This is a team that's been very inconsistent this year. Defense hasn't played all that well. But defensive tackle J.T. Surratt, hamstring injury last week against Furman. Why he was even playing against Furman, I don't really know. But he's going to be out at least 2 to 4 weeks, possibly longer. I think a defensive tackle injury may be mitigated a little bit by how much sideline to sideline running Auburn likes to do. But anything that weakens the South Carolina defense, given how they've played so far, is definitely a concern.
Yeah, that's definitely a concern because Auburn, even though they do run sideline to sideline, they're such a good running team. They're going to run so often. They probably could wear a team like South Carolina down. I guess that's why we're seeing such a big number. It struck me at first when I saw Auburn favored by that much against South Carolina. That was a really big line, but I think it's a big line for a reason.
We'll get into our Inside the Line segment this week, talk about a couple of interesting line moves in the market. And we've got 4 game breakdowns. Also, we'll wrap up the show with our Pick 6 segment, where we pick 6 games rapid-fire fashion and give out picks on those, as well as the exclusive podcast free pick in the show. I mentioned it already, the Miami-Virginia Tech line movement, about a 5-point movement in this game, really. Crossed the key number of 0, flipped favorite in this game. Miami now a big favorite, or not a big favorite, but a 2.5, 3-point favorite. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this game since it is a Thursday game and our listeners listen all the way up to Saturday morning. But you surprised at all by this move?
I am surprised because of the way Virginia Tech usually plays at home. A night game, national TV. I think that Virginia Tech's going to show up better, although Virginia Tech certainly disappointed me quite a bit this year. I was a lot higher on Michael Brewer than I should have been, obviously, and I'm starting to wonder if it's just part of an offensive problem that Frank Beamer's teams have. But, they still have a pretty good defense, even though they have a lot of injuries. And Miami's offense is being led by a freshman quarterback who is mistake-prone. So I'd be worried to lay the points there with Miami. I'm slightly surprised that the line moved that much. I think it was a little bit of a bad line to open Virginia Tech as a 3-point favorite, but I think Pick'em would be more along where I would think it should be.
Well, quite a few moves in MAC games this week as MACtion getting some notice, and this is something that we've talked about on previous shows where these MAC games, they tend to have some of the softer lines of all the conferences, and these are the ones that you see quite a bit of movement on throughout the week. Also because it's a little bit harder to get information and news about these teams. So once something breaks, you definitely see the market react a little bit. Central Michigan, a team I know you've been pretty high on throughout the year, an improving offense there under Dan Enos. They take on Buffalo this week. That number up from 3 to 5.5. I believe I saw it as high as 6 or 6.5 yesterday. But Buffalo fired Jeff Quinn a couple of weeks ago. So Central Michigan getting some love here as a road favorite. Again, not a spot that they're really accustomed to.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that Central Michigan is getting so much respect and the line moves going that way is because Central Michigan lost last week to Ball State. But if you look at the box score, that was really a misleading final. Central Michigan outgained them 426 to 287. 5 turnovers from Central Michigan was really the killer there. So they moved the ball up and down the field, turned it over several times in the red zone. And so as long as they can take care of the football, they probably have a good chance this week. I think the odds makers set that line a little bit lower because Buffalo had a bye week, a new coach, maybe thinking that they could rally around them. But Buffalo is not a very good team this year.
No, that Buffalo team lost a lot. Not only did they lose Khalil Mack, but they also lost Brandon Oliver and Alex Noitz, their top wide receiver. Also Colby Way, a defensive end. He's not a guy that generates a lot of headlines, but when you're a team like Buffalo and you're losing your 4 best players in one off season, that's certainly going to cause some turnover. Another game that's moved quite a bit here. Oklahoma State opened a 3-point favorite. They're down to -1. Or this game is pick at some books. They take on West Virginia this week. Obviously, everyone's going to be looking for the letdown spot from West Virginia. They're coming off a huge win in Morgantown against Baylor, taking on an Oklahoma State team that was completely embarrassed last week. I think Mike Gundy has a little bit of a coaching advantage on Dana Holgorsen, yet this line is moving in West Virginia's direction, and it really wouldn't shock me if West Virginia is favored by kickoff.
No, it wouldn't shock me either. I think that West Virginia has started to prove that they're for real at this point. Clint Trickett's really having an impressive season. Like I said, it's hard to know what to make of Oklahoma State at this point because they played so well against Florida State, but have been disappointing since then, really. Oklahoma State at a disadvantage at the quarterback spot in this game. Garmin's been pretty good, but he's mistake-prone, and I've seen him make some pretty bad decisions when I've watched Oklahoma State. Like I said, Trickett's really playing well. This is a tough game, though. I think that the line movement makes sense for it to be around Tick, but I'd hate to take either side in that game.
Well, one final one to look at. We don't give these two teams a whole lot of love on the College Football Podcast. We do talk about Hawaii a little bit in our Handicapping the Hardwood College Basketball Podcast. But Nevada down from 4 to 3, although BetOnline showing a 2.5 now, and we're recording here on early Wednesday afternoon. So some money coming in on the Warriors. Obviously, travel to Hawaii is always a big concern. You got a Nevada team plays in a little bit of altitude going out to the islands. You agree with the move on this game?
I don't know what to make of this line move. I think that Nevada is quite a bit better than Hawaii, but like you said, Hawaii is a different team to handicap at home because of the inherent advantages that they have just from their home field advantage. And when you go to Hawaii, we've talked about it so many times before, the last thing you're thinking about is the game usually. So I think Nevada's a lot better than Hawaii, so I guess I disagree with the line move in that way, but it's also one of those games where if I see the market coming in on Hawaii, I would not want to back Nevada at all because there's been a lot of strange things that happen out in Hawaii, and I wouldn't want to be against that line move.
We'll get into this week's 4 games. We're going to talk about a couple from the SEC West, and then we're also going to talk about the Big Ten and the Pac-12. But we're going to start with Mississippi State and Kentucky, and it's been a really long time since CBS fought to have Kentucky in that 3:30 time slot.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked about this one a little bit off the air. It's an interesting line because you would have thought that Mississippi State would have been favored by more than this, and both of us believe, I think that that tells us the odds makers really think that Kentucky's going to make a little bit of a stand here. Kentucky is much improved this year. They had a major hiccup last week. That surprised me a lot that they lost that badly at LSU. But Kentucky's much, much better. Stoops has this program going up in a big way right now. I think Kentucky fans have a lot to look forward to because they've really been recruiting a lot better, and it's starting to show on the field already. Mississippi State, though, had a bye week last week. They should be really well prepared, and I think you have to say that Mississippi State has more impressive wins than anybody else in the country at this point. So, interesting line here. Really, Mississippi State, should be well prepared for this game, and I wouldn't think that they'd overlook Kentucky. So, it does make it an interesting line.
Yeah, it really does. And, I don't want to rain on the Kentucky parade, but you really have to wonder how good this team is. They lost in triple overtime to Florida in a game that they should have won. They really got screwed over by the officiating in that game. And as we know, Florida not a very good team. The win over South Carolina, near and dear to my heart, a team that I've watched frequently this season. I believe the only game I've missed is the Furman one. And they're just not a good football team. They have a lot of problems offensively, all sorts of problems defensively. Spurrier seems to be outthinking himself on a game-by-game basis. So I'm not really sure how much emphasis I want to put on that South Carolina win. Wasn't a great spot for the Gamecocks either. And then you look at Kentucky and what they did last week at LSU, blown out by an LSU team that had also struggled. So I really don't know how good Kentucky is. I think if this game would have been last week, where Mississippi State was coming off the Auburn win, it would have been a little bit different. But you give the Bulldogs a chance to come down from that win, get refocused and prepared. The more I look at this game, the more tempted I am to take Mississippi State under 14. When currently the line's sitting 13.5, pretty much across the market.
Yeah, Kentucky played Mississippi State well last year, so maybe that has a little bit to do with it. A 6-point game at Starkville. Although I think it's pretty fair to say that Mississippi State's a totally different team than they were last year. And if I break down this game a little bit more, I looked at it as a big shot for Kentucky to see where they stand, kind of a measuring stick game. The problem for them, though, is I just can't see Kentucky stopping Mississippi State's offense, and that's really a big key here because Kentucky doesn't have a high-powered offense. If this is a really high-scoring game, I think Kentucky's going to lose. So if they can slow down Mississippi State on offense, they have a chance. But, I mean, Dak Prescott's been awesome all year. The Heisman favorite at a lot of books, I believe, at this point, and he deserves to be. So, he's really been the key to the offense. He's changed the way things go for Mississippi State. He can do everything really well, and he has enough players around him that it's going to be really tough for Kentucky to stop them. And like I say, I would lean toward Mississippi State as well, although I'm a little bit confused by this one, and it's not going to be a play for me.
Well, I think another thing that you have to look at with Kentucky is, I've already talked about their win over South Carolina, and I don't think South Carolina is very strong in the trenches this year. They've had some offensive line injuries, and their offensive line was really blown up a little bit in the preseason. People talking about how they were the best offensive line in the SEC. I thought they would be good. I didn't think that they would be elite, and the injuries just, kind of took a toll on them. On the defensive line, you take away Clowney, you take away Sutton, so they had some problems there as well. Looking at last week's game for Kentucky, it was the first game where they played a team that was significantly better than them in the trenches, and you see what happened. LSU ran for 303 yards in that game. Mississippi State, one of the biggest offensive lines in the country, very strong on the defensive line. Kentucky is going to get pushed around in the trenches in this game, and like I said, we saw what happened last week when that was the case. I think that's going to be the case again this week. I really hate laying 13.5 in a conference game, with a Mississippi State team that's in some uncharted water. But I think I got to look to the Bulldogs here because, as you said, I don't see how Kentucky stops the running attack.
And that's a good point because Mississippi State ran it really well against Auburn as well, 223 yards on the ground, and that's an Auburn defense that's pretty good this year. The Tigers have done well stopping the run so far this season, but Mississippi State was able to run on them. Mississippi State's offensive line has really, really been good. I thought they'd be pretty good, but they're a lot better than I thought they would be. So I think that's a good point that Kentucky's going to have a hard time with that. I would also say that if you like Mississippi State, I think you'd want to bet it pretty soon because I don't think 13.5 will be around for too long.
No, I don't think so either. Talk about another game in the SEC West now. Ole Miss and the aforementioned LSU Tigers. LSU, really struggled in the swamp on October 11th against Florida the week after they got blown out by Auburn. And then they blow out Kentucky last week. So perception shifting a little bit on the LSU Tigers. Meanwhile, Ole Miss coming in here, they take on Auburn next week. So this is a game that they're really going to have to be prepared for. I think this is a fascinating game and a fascinating line because you look at it, the totals come down from 47 to 44.5. People clearly expecting a close game. Ole Miss 3.5-point favorite. I think this is a big time battle in the trenches for both these teams.
I like Ole Miss in this game, and I'm a little bit upset with myself for not taking it when I was 3 earlier. Ole Miss defense is really, really good, and I like the fact that the Rebels are so balanced on defense. That's something that you don't see very often in college football nowadays. Usually you have a defense that's either really good against the run or really good against the pass. Mississippi's really good against both. Like I said, that's really tough to find nowadays, and I think that's really important too because LSU has to run to win this game. If LSU can't run the ball on Mississippi, they're not going to win because I don't think anybody trusts LSU's quarterbacks to throw it all over Mississippi. So, I think Mississippi's where I would go in this one for sure. And the total was something I was kind of eyeing to try to play the under, but they definitely released it too low for me there. Bo Wallace is playing a lot better. I will say that's the one question mark I have, though, still about Mississippi. A lot of other people are saying, Bo Wallace is just a totally different guy. I think there's still a little bit of a question mark there because though he has played well the last few games, he's shown so much that he can be turnover prone that I worry about him a little bit in this type of situation. That's why I didn't fire on 3 earlier, although I am regretting it a little bit right now.
I worry about Bo Wallace a lot in this game because Ole Miss really took the crowd out of things at Kyle Field a couple weeks ago against Texas A&M. I love Texas A&M in that spot, and it clearly didn't come through for me. I mean, that was a 21-0 game early in the second quarter. So it really took the crowd out of the game. I don't think Ole Miss can jump on LSU the same way. And you look at a Death Valley crowd, it's going to be a night game in Baton Rouge. Bo Wallace is going to be in a fight, I think, in this game. And he's going to have to go against a loud crowd in the second half, something that he really hasn't had to deal with yet. They've only played a couple of road games at Vanderbilt and at Texas A&M. And like I said, the 12th man at Kyle Field was taken out of that game very early. So this is a big measuring stick game for Bo Wallace. And I think it comes at a good time because, like I said, they take on Auburn next week, trap game against Arkansas the week before the Egg Bowl. So they've got 4 tough games left out of their 5. And I think Bo Wallace can really silence some critics if he goes into Baton Rouge and plays a strong game.
Oh, that's a really, really tough schedule for Mississippi. And I think that you could look at both teams and say that some of their recent wins aren't quite as impressive as we thought at the time. Mississippi winning at Texas A&M. Texas A&M, we've talked about in the past, overrated for sure after their early win against South Carolina. And, last week validated that for sure when they were drilled at Alabama. LSU, though, also, their win at Florida, they probably should have lost that game if it weren't for Jeff Driscoll having some real issues. And we could talk a long time about Jeff Driscoll struggling this year and Florida really just being awful, especially last week against Missouri. But LSU probably should have lost that game in the Swamp. They barely won that game. They made a really good statement last week against Kentucky, but I'm still not convinced that LSU is very good. And I do think Mississippi's a really good team. I worry about Bo Wallace, but Bo Wallace is better than LSU's quarterbacks too. So Mississippi has a lot better team overall. I do worry about laying points on the road at Baton Rouge, especially in a night game. It's going to be a really, really tough environment. But I think Mississippi's a lot better team than LSU, and I think there's a chance that they could make a statement here. So I like Mississippi.
Well, we'll move to the Big Ten. We'll talk about Ohio State and Penn State. It's good to finally talk about Ohio State again. Obviously, both of us big Buckeye fans. Ohio State scored 50 or more in each of their last 4 games. But, the strength of schedule argument certainly relevant here. We've talked about Trevon Boykin as possibly being the most improved player in the country, but J.T. Barrett is light years different from what he was against Bud Foster's Virginia Tech defense. He was completely overwhelmed in that game, had no idea where the blitzers were coming from. I don't want to say it's an excusable loss, especially with how Virginia Tech has looked since that game, but I think Ohio State's had a really drastic turnaround. This is the first of 3 straight 8 p.m. kickoffs for Ohio State, which is a pretty interesting scheduling quirk there. But they're a 13.5-point favorite going to Happy Valley. James Franklin off a bye. He really wants to get that first Big Ten signature victory here.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think that this would be a really good spot for James Franklin to get that signature win. And, he's been pointing toward this game for quite a while. Also, you look at Penn State's schedule. They have had a really interesting schedule here lately. They've only played once in October, so they've had 2 bye weeks in the last 3. They've lost their last 2 games, a really poor showing against Northwestern and then a pretty bad showing also at Michigan. So Penn State not been playing well of late. Nittany Lions were certainly overrated after their first 4 wins. Really didn't beat anybody very good there. And they were pretty fortunate to win at Rutgers. So Penn State, a team that I don't think too much of at this point. And Ohio State's really good at this point. Their defense still has quite a few question marks, but that offense is playing extremely well. I think it's safe to say that Virginia Tech should be really happy that they played Ohio State when they did, because Ohio State would be a really big favorite over Virginia Tech right now, and I think they beat them badly. So the Buckeyes playing really well. J.T. Barrett's been amazing. He's been far better than I ever thought he could be. And, it certainly helps him to have the weapons around him that he does. Elliott's played really well in the backfield. Also, the wide receivers have stepped up in a big way. You've got guys like Marshall, Thomas, Wilson, Spencer, really good wide receivers for Ohio State, the best wide receivers they've had in several years. Also, something that a lot of people overlook for Ohio State is they have 2 excellent tight ends. Hireman and Vanette are really playing well. And that's a weapon that Ohio State hasn't really had in a while. And I like that Urban Meyer and the Buckeyes are using those tight ends quite a bit. So Ohio State has a lot of different weapons for Bear to spread it around to, and he's doing an excellent job distributing the football.
Yeah, I love Ohio State in this game. It's one I've already taken. I've also taken the over in this game because I think Ohio State's going to have a lot of success. You look at Penn State's resume, they've only given up 15 points per game, but they've played Central Florida, Akron, Rutgers, UMass, Northwestern, and that team up north. They have not played an offense anywhere near Ohio State's capability. So the defense hasn't been tested. That's a very misleading statistic to say that they're sixth in the country in points allowed because they just haven't played anybody. 111th in the country in points for at 21.2. The offense has had a lot of problems. Christian Hackenberg looked really good last year under the tutelage of Bill O'Brien. It seems like he's regressing a little bit this year, although he did lose Allen Robinson, which would probably make anybody's numbers regress. But this Penn State team is not very good offensively. They rack up some passing yards, but they can't convert it into touchdowns. Ohio State's defense is still a little bit porous at times, but also, when you talk about a team giving up 28, 24, 17 points, you have to look at the fact that they scored 50 or more in each of those three games. So they're looking at the two deep. They're letting some underclassmen play. They're playing some soft zone. They're trying not to get anybody hurt. We haven't really seen Ohio State play with intensity yet, and they're still out there hanging 50 points on everybody. So I think when they really step up, like I think they do on Saturday night, this is a good chance for Ohio State to announce their presence in the college football playoff hunt, with a couple weeks to go before they play that big game against Michigan State in East Lansing.
Yeah, Penn State's defensive stats are really misleading at this point in the year, like you said. They're first in the nation in rushing defense at this point. They're sixth in the nation in total defense and points allowed. I think those numbers are going to look a lot different after this weekend. I think Ohio State's going to put up a really big number there. I like the over more than I like the side, but I do like Ohio State quite a bit in this one. I was really hoping the line was going to be smaller than that, but, it makes a lot of sense for Ohio State to be a pretty significant favorite here. I would say that Penn State's biggest problem is their offensive line. I think Christian Hackenberg's still a really good quarterback, and I'm still pretty high on his potential, but Penn State has not given him any time to throw. Also, they don't have any running game at all. They're averaging 93 yards per game on the ground. So Hackenberg's been having to do it all himself with a bad offensive line in front of him. That's also a really, really big reason to like Ohio State in this game. Ohio State's defensive line is really good. The Buckeyes have a lot of question marks in the secondary still, but no question marks on the defensive line for the Buckeyes. And they should dominate Penn State's offensive line. You got to expect that Hackenberg's not going to have very much time to throw. I do think Penn State will score some points with maybe some deep throws, but this is definitely a bad matchup for Penn State. I know that James Franklin and Penn State would really love to win this game, and it's a tough place to play at Happy Valley, especially at nighttime, but I think this is too big of a mismatch.
And don't forget Larry Johnson, the former coach at Penn State, now the defensive line coach at Ohio State. So he knows the weaknesses of that Penn State offensive line. I think he'll be a real big asset this week. We'll finish up in the Pac-12 here. Southern Cal at Utah. This line is extremely interesting to me. Southern Cal, a 1-point favorite here. As we know, Utah, a very big home field advantage given the altitude and the conditions. This line is just stunning to me. I really think Utah should be maybe -2.5 or -3.
USC is a good team. They have a lot of talent on their team, but their problem is depth. And key point here for me is that if your main problem is depth, you don't want to go play at Utah. You play at some elevation, a really tough place to play. This is going to be a tough environment for USC, and they don't have 2 or 3 deep, really good players like a lot of the other top teams do. And we've seen that be a problem for them in some games in the past. They've played poorly in the fourth quarter against Arizona State. They also didn't look good against Boston College when they were run all over. I think USC is a good defense, but I think that they get worn down here by a Utah offensive line that's really good. Utah's running the ball really well with Booker. So Kyle Whittingham's an underrated coach as well. This team's really tough. They're gritty. strong in the trenches. Like I said, I really think the big key here is that USC, tough matchup for them at Utah, because if depth is an issue, you don't want to go play at Utah.
Well, it's certainly an interesting scheduling spot for Utah as well. They played on October 4th at UCLA, and then they played a Thursday night game on October 16th at Oregon State. They won that game in double overtime, so they had the extra week to prepare for Oregon State, actually a week and a half, and then a couple extra days to prepare for Southern Cal as well. So I think that sets up nicely for Whittingham. I agree with you. I think he's a fantastic coach. A little bit concerned about the Utah quarterback situation. Neither Travis Wilson nor Kendall Thompson's really taken the bull by the horns to get that job. On the flip side, Cody Kessler's looked pretty good for Southern Cal. I think this line is off. It's not a game that's really on my radar to play. But I think both of these teams are fade material next week, where USC goes back out on the road, third time in 4 weeks. They go to Pullman to take on Washington State. Utah goes out on the road to take on Arizona State. So that was part of the reason I wanted to talk about this game, is because, as a bettor, you have to look ahead. You have to find these spots, get a number in your head of where you want to target the spread, and then act on it if it comes where you want it to. So I think looking ahead, both of these teams are fade material next week.
I agree with you. I think both of those are good fade spots. And I think we definitely should give Cody Kessler a lot of credit, because he's been really good this year. That's been something USC really needs, because they don't have Madden in the running game. So USC needed Kessler to step up. He's done that for sure. He padded his stats a little bit last week against Colorado. I don't think it's going to come near as easy against Utah this week, but USC is a team that has a high upside, but they also have some real weaknesses. So last year when these two played, 19-3 USC, 260 total yards of offense, 201 for Utah. So pretty ugly, low-scoring game there. Was surprised to see the total at 56. I think that both of these defenses are a little bit better than most people believe. And Utah's a team that's shown a lot of toughness at this point in the season. They lost one at home to Washington State, which was certainly a surprise. They jumped out to a big lead. Seems like they got a little bit complacent in that game. But you look at the fact that you could certainly say that winning in Ann Arbor isn't as impressive as it has been in the past. But, winning 26-10 at Michigan, still slightly impressive. And then certainly very impressive winning at UCLA 30-28. And then Corvallis is a tough place to play as well, winning 29-23. So this Utah team that's usually been only good at home, or only good to back at home, has actually been really good on the road this year. So I like getting them here at pick, or even a little bit better. So I'll take Utah. Utah is also 5-0 against the spread in their last 5 versus a team with a winning record. So they're able to rise to the occasion. I think it's a good spot for the Utes.
I think I like the under. I think Utah's strength generally tends to be in the trenches. I think it's mitigated a little bit against USC here. I think the altitude slows USC's offense down a little bit as well. You talked about how they're not very deep. So that's something that Steve Sarkisian certainly needs to be aware of. So I think I like the under in this game more than a side. So about 90 seconds left streaming live here. We're going to jump into our Pick 6 segment. 6 games, quick picks. I try to throw Kyle a couple curveballs in there and throw him some games that fly under the radar a little bit. But we're going to start in the Big 12 with a noon kick, 11 a.m. local time, between Texas and Kansas State. Kansas State, a 10-point favorite.
Well, it's a tough one. I think that's a really strong line. I'm going to take Kansas State. I know you're going to go with the other side, so we're going to disagree here. I'm going to take Kansas State just because Texas has been so inconsistent. I worry about their offense on the road here at Kansas State. I think Bill Snyder's going to have Kansas State ready to play. I don't really expect a letdown for them. So I'll take Kansas State, even though I'm hesitant to lay that many points.
I'm going to take Texas. I think Texas has played a lot better of late. They had a 48-45 game against Iowa State. It was kind of a sandwich spot for them coming off the Red River rivalry. And then they also played Baylor the week before, so a couple tough weeks before that. But I like them here. I think the defense is playing a lot better, as I said, despite what happened last week. And Kansas State coming off that big win over Oklahoma on the road, I think they're in for a little bit of a letdown, despite the reputation of Bill Snyder. We've got about 10 seconds left streaming live. Please download the podcast to hear our final thoughts for this week. Ohio at Western Michigan. I bring this one up because it's crossed through the key number of 10. Western Michigan opened 9.5, up to 10.5 now. So the Broncos, 10.5-point favorite over the Bobcats.
I'll take Western Michigan here. Western Michigan's really an improved team. They had a really good recruiting class this year, and some of those guys are already showing up in a big way so far this season. It's certainly disappointing to get 10.5 instead of 9.5, but I really think this is a game where Western Michigan wins by a couple touchdowns or more. OU is not the team they have been in the past. This is the worst Bobcats team we've seen in quite a while, so I'll take the favorite.
Yeah, I think that's where I'd have to go as well. I think there's some credence to this line move because it's, got to be a fairly sharp one. I don't think anyone's rushing to back Western Michigan after how they've looked the last couple of years. Also, Western Michigan coming off a couple of impressive road wins. Now they get to come back home. So I'll take the directional Michigan school here, I guess. We'll talk about Texas Tech and TCU. TCU 23-point favorite at home against Texas Tech. Jakeem Grant questionable for this game after suffering an injury in a off-campus, I don't know what you want to call it, brawl, melee, whatever you want to call it. So he's questionable. That's Texas Tech's top wide receiver. It's TCU big favorite this week.
Yeah, I'm looking really chalky at this point, but I'm taking TCU. I don't like Texas Tech at all. I don't like the direction they're going. TCU is a tough team at this point. I like Gary Patterson a lot more than Ryan Gosling. Cliff Kingsbury. But TCU is a team that I'm high on. I've been high on them all year. I think TCU's covered the spread in every single game this year. So the odds makers are trying to catch up with them, but I think TCU covers a big number here.
I'm going to take Texas Tech. It's a painful pick to make, but TCU plays at Morgantown next week in a game that they clearly have circled now after what happened to Baylor. So I'm going to take Texas Tech with a little bit of a look ahead for TCU. We'll go back to the Pac-12 now. Arizona, 2.5-point favorites, going up to Pullman to take on Washington State. Wildcats off a bye. So are the Cougars. So this is definitely a coaching battle here between Rich Rod and Mike Leach.
This is a sneaky good game. I'll take Washington State at home. I'm not totally convinced that Arizona is as good as they have looked in some of their games lately. Obviously, they picked up a huge win at Oregon, so they deserve respect. But there's been a little bit of a line move here to Washington State already, and I think that line move's justified. I'll take Washington State.
I'm going to take Arizona State. I think Rich Rod's doing great things with that program down there. He has a little bit of a look-ahead spot with UCLA on deck, but with 2 weeks, he probably could install some things for the UCLA game as well. Washington State is kind of an up-and-coming team and a little bit dangerous of an opponent because of the way they throw the football around. So I think they'll be focused enough to take care of business here. So I'm going to go with the Wildcats. Man, I'm chalky this week too. And then finally, I wish I could throw you a little bit more of a curveball type game, but I've got to ask about South Carolina and Auburn. South Carolina, 17.5-point dog, not where people really expected this line to be prior to the season. But this is a very big number for Auburn to cover. Obviously, perception playing a role. The SEC East, not very good. SEC West, easily the best division in the country, and it's not even close. So are you willing to pay the inflated price on Auburn?
Gosh, I really, really don't like this game at all, but I'm going to take South Carolina with that many points. Under 17, I might have said something different, but 17 is a pretty important number. South Carolina, not a very good team, but I wonder how motivated Auburn's going to be to blow them away here. So at 17.5, I'm going to take the underdog.
I think I am as well. I think South Carolina is going to try to reestablish the run in this game. Spurrier's been throwing way too much with Dylan Thompson. Thompson has not had a tremendous year for them. And I think you can run on Auburn. I mean, Mississippi State showed that. South Carolina, not the caliber of Mississippi State, but I think you can run on the Tigers' defense. So if South Carolina could do that, they'll keep the ball away, have a better chance of sticking around in this game. I like the Gamecocks to cover, but probably by the slimmest of margins. They're certainly outclassed in this game. So I'll do it for our Pick 6 segment. And the last thing to take care of is the exclusive free pick for this week.
All right, we got back on track last week with the over Ball State and Central Michigan, so we'll try to make it 2 in a row on the free picks. I'm going to sound really chalky now. I don't like doing this. People who follow me very closely know that I don't pick big favorites too often, but I think there's a good reason to take Memphis this week against SMU. SMU is in a lot of trouble right now. They just got drilled by Cincinnati last week. Cincinnati's defense is really, really bad, and SMU couldn't do anything against Cincinnati's defense. Memphis is much improved offensively, and they've had a good defense for several years in a row now. I think that Memphis goes to SMU and wins this game really big. Memphis minus 23 is the free pick.
I like it. Look at you going all chalky. Memphis coming off a bye as well, and, they can't be too happy with their performance in that game against Houston. They lost 28-24, so I think there's a little bit of extra motivation to blow somebody away. It's a Memphis team that really hasn't done that very much over the last few years, so they get a chance to pick on a really bad opponent. SMU dead last in points for and points against, so I like it. I think that's a good place to look. So that pretty much wraps it up for us. Any final thoughts you want to add?
Well, it was a great week 8 for us, so hopefully our thoughts for week 9 are just as good, and we'll see next week how we fared this week, but everybody have a good weekend.
Absolutely. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. I did tweet out the link to subscribe to us on iTunes a little bit before the show, so make sure you do that. If you don't listen to the live broadcast, it'll download automatically to your iTunes or Apple device, so that's something that you'll certainly want to take advantage of. So for Kyle Hunter, I'm Adam Burke. Enjoy the weekend of college football, everybody, and we'll talk to you again next week.